It's not completely stopped the chaos, though, has it? As we've seen, some people are now talking about a state of emergency. But what will be the right route? Well, let's speak more about the state of emergency versus the current state of disaster. Professor Elmien Plessis from Northwest University's Faculty of Law joins us now. Professor, good morning to you. It's such a pleasure speaking to you. Can we answer that first question if we could? I know there's a lot of legality involved, but for someone like the layman like myself, the difference between state of emergency and state of disaster.
Yes, so that's quite a big question. I also think we must just first start with the fact that emergency situation, and when we use emergency legislation, we signal that there's something extraordinary happening. And what emergency legislation usually does is it shifts a lot of power to the executive to deal with the emergency or the disaster, as we've seen in South Africa. So the nature of emergency legislation is such that it changes the structures of government to facilitate the executive to deal with a crisis quite urgent. So both the State of Emergency Act and Disaster Management Act does that. But the state of emergency is different. I'll start with what the state of emergency is before I get to the Disaster Management Act. But a state of emergency is declared in terms of Section 37 of the Constitution, and the requirements there are that the life of the nation must be threatened by war, invasion, or general insurrection or disorder. And then secondly, that the declaration is necessary to restore peace and order. So the first requirement, of course, it's you must apply the law to the facts, and that's, I think, where we differ. The life of the nation must be threatened. So it must be so exceptional that we cannot deal with it in terms of normal legislation. And the declaration then must be necessary to restore peace and order. And I think, you know, the questions that we are asking is this threat so significant that it, you know, requires us to declare a state of emergency, and is the declaration of the state of emergency necessary to restore peace and order? So what happens when you have a state of emergency is our rights in the Bill of Rights, not all of them, but most of them, they get what is called derogated, which just means it's temporarily taken away, if I can put it in layman's terms. So, you know, your right to property is not guaranteed anymore, your right of freedom to movement, etc., etc. And that's quite invasive, especially if you think that a lot of power is in the hands of the executive. And that is why when we deal with emergency legislation, we say it's only in exceptional circumstances. So states of emergency, at least there are checks and balances. So when the president, so it falls under the president, when he declares a state of emergency and he makes regulations in terms of the State of Emergency Act, then those regulations and that declaration goes in front of the Parliament, who can engage with it. A state of emergency can only be declared for 21 days. It can be extended, but it must be voted on in the National Assembly for extension. So that's how it differs a lot from the Disaster Management Act. The suspension of the rights, that's different from the Disaster Management Act, and the fact that the regulation and the declaration goes to the National Assembly for inputs. Of course, the courts, the Constitution also said a court may decide the validity of the declaration or any legislation enacted under it. So it
Professor,
also a lot from what we had.
Let me come in quickly, Professor, if I could. I'll tell you why. You raised a good question. I'm hoping in the last minute and a half I have with you. You mentioned that there's all kinds of regulations and rights that can be taken away as a result of a state of emergency. Can you, just in the last 90 seconds or so, tell me what is the test for a state of emergency? You mentioned that there needs to be an outright threat against the entire nation. Is there a black and white test that can be applied before we get to a state of emergency?
No, and that's the thing. We've never had a state of emergency under democratic South Africa. So I must say that I was quite surprised when I read the State of Emergency Act yesterday that the emergency can also be declared to an area within the Republic, so it doesn't have to be applicable to the whole Republic. But what we do have is case law from European Court of Human Rights, where they had similar situations, and they say that the threat must be real or imminent. I think that's complied with. It involves the whole nation, and then that I'm not sure, because our Act allows for areas, and then that the continuance of organized life or the nation is threatened and normal measures are inadequate. So I think we sit now with a question are the normal measures that we have adequate to deal with the situation, or do we really need to go onto a state of emergency? And that will be a question of interpretation, really, how you interpret what's happening in the country against these measures.
I appreciate your time in unpacking it for the layman, such as myself, Professor. I really do appreciate Professor Elmien du Plessis from Northwest University's Faculty of Law, State of Emergency versus State of Disaster.